Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much to everyone, both on Zoom and the full house that's here in front of me as well. It's a real honour to be invited to present to your colleagues, particularly when you're new, maybe a little daunting as well. When I speak here today about academic integrity, I trying to broaden that idea out in terms of the effect that it has on students, both before they enter accredited courses such as the PGCE that we have here in the school, in the education school, nursing, medicine, physiotherapy, etc. Also all the way through to employability in those fields. So really the broad term, not necessarily about handing in assessment that hasn't been plagiarized. Yeah. To give you a bit of an outline of what I'll be speaking to today, bit of background to the sort of research that I'm talking about and that really makes me tick, and the sort of research that I find interesting, and to give you backgrounds for people who are not familiar with inclusive higher education and disabilities, I guess specifically. I'll talk about some of the theories that, again, I find useful for this area, some empirical work that I've done, and then we'll end on some conclusions here about the sort of work that I have been doing in Australia before I came here, and that I am working on to continue here at Southampton. Now, this is work that, and the work I'll be presenting today specifically, we have 3 publications out so far. We've been doing this for a couple of years, my colleague and I, at Deakin University in Melbourne. And then one just went up for review, and then there's also a book contract. But what's important here to really, I guess, bring to the fore is that we're examining inherent requirements or competency standards, which we're understanding as a point of academic integrity, how they're mobilized by higher education institutions, and in relation to matters of integrity, disability, difference, diversity, inherency of professional skills, etc., and how these, in some instances, well, quite a lot actually, are in contrast with competing agendas that universities have for inclusive pedagogies, inclusive ways of being and knowing and relating to others, and also how maybe disrupting the way that we come at these ideas could help us to reposition academic integrity in ways that is more affirmative towards difference. That's I guess the premise behind this sort of work. To give you a bit more background about this particular area, and I hope we're on the 4th slide. I will ask this often. Thank you. This is generally the way we understand inclusion for students with disabilities in higher education, both in Australia and here, with I guess with a nod to the particular types of legislation that we have about widening participation. And the focus has really been on widening participation of disabled students in higher ed. And we do that by understanding that if a student with a disability requires what we will call a reasonable adjustment, then that is the means by which we will include them. And there's a lot to be said for the optimistic outlook that such an approach to widening participation has had. Particularly in the UK, we have quite enormous numbers of students disclosing that they have a disability to higher education institutions across the UK and in Australia as well. But like I say, it doesn't necessarily let us consider some of the normative approaches to course design, etc., in regard to, well, we'll make reasonable adjustments for students if we can, and they need to be reasonable. And you'll also note here that these are ideas that came from the Equality Act in 2010 and the Bradley Report in Australia 2008. These are somewhat old and perhaps outdated ideas. Now, let's get into thinking about academic integrity. And I only yesterday found this really quite interesting literature review about academic integrity, and they have even said that it's a problematic term. It's a phrase that is open to different interpretations. I'd argue most terms are, really. Academic integrity is widely used, and it's presupposed that we understand what it means, but perhaps we don't really. And of course, they mention here that, and they were, and some might have better understandings of this. They were contrasting the definitions of integrity and academic integrity in particular in English and in Chinese, and noting how that they kind of don't align, these definitions. But again, they've also said here that these also refer to wider implications without naming what they are. And I think this is one of the areas that I'm really trying to push, the way we understand competence and inherency in education, in terms of how we can provide more employability opportunities for more diverse students. 4, higher education institutions in the UK. The competency standards are defined, the core competencies and abilities that a student must demonstrate to be able to access, to be accepted to progress within and successfully complete a program of study before qualifying for a profession. And again, these tend to appear in specific courses that are accredited, that are registered, nursing, medicine, and perhaps for really good reason, but perhaps they are also part of ongoing barriers to higher education that many people face, not only those with disabilities. Yeah. Hopefully we're on number 7, and I'm just going to take you briefly through the Australian context where a lot of the work that I'm referring to today has been done, and well, that we've done. And the term inherent requirements is what we use in Australia for competency standards. I'm not sure which one I like the least. But interestingly, this one has inherency or inherent requirements have been copied from the world of work and employment, where employers are actually legally able to discriminate against persons with disabilities if they cannot perform a particular job job description that is part of their work. Again, here's where we have the great idea of reasonable adjustments that can be made to try to find ways to get around particular requirements if students need them, but if workers or students need them, but invariably those understood, taken for granted levels, standards, competency remain always. Yeah. And hopefully that's number 8, and they're referred to in a couple of different ways, I guess, in the higher education sector. And I guess I've been banging on about this a bit too long already. Academic integrity on one hand, and also used to set minimum standards for registration by professions. Now, of course, these could be really useful, but I think we could come at them with certain reservations that inherent requirements are not necessarily compulsory or traditional requirements. They lack legislative agendas, whereas reasonable adjustments do not. They ask us, though, to really define what we are teaching and what we are assessing, and what is essential for a student to learn and to demonstrate in order to participate in a course. And let's hope go out and graduate and get a job in their chosen profession. I'm going to just take you through briefly a whole heap of examples, and they, you'll see here that ultimately all of these, and these relate to teaching courses in Australia specifically, although I have found the same here in the UK: sustainable performance, strengths and mobility, sensory abilities, interpersonal engagement, cognitive communication, legal responsibilities, ethics, etc. These are asking people effectively to be robots in order to be teachers. Now, take you to one that seems interesting to me about motor skills, and they're suggesting that a person who wants to come in and study teaching needs to have fine and gross motor skills to the level that they can bend, lift, stand, sit, etc., in order to reduce risk. And a lot of this comes down to the reduction of risk and the promotion of dexterity and having the capacity to run a class in a school, if you ever get to the point of graduating, that is using all of your gross and fine motor skills. Also, obviously, one that's close to my heart, the sensory. We also have behavioral regulation, the continuation of good regulated behavior. I mean, if we're having a miserable day, I think many of my colleagues here would agree, if you're having a miserable day on a school day, you stay home. Yeah. And you don't tell anyone that you're having a bad day. Not so easy for teachers in schools. And I hope here that I'm on number 13, that I thought I would particularly highlight about communications. And we're asking all students who are entering into courses of this kind to have effective verbal communication in English. That is essential. And also that that communication skills need to also encompass your capacity to be able to use ICTs effectively. Again, I feel like this is very robotic, and maybe it's a good thing we have Chat GDP these days to do these roles for us. On to 14, and here's the thing that these couple of researchers from Canada have really noted that, and that this comes from a literature review that they've done on EDI agendas in universities across the world, that they have really found that, well, in spite of all of this, people with disabilities, both students, academics and non-academics, are discriminated against in the sector for a wealth of different reasons that relate to physical environments, that relate to pedagogies, that relate to a whole lot of, inconsistencies about what we understand inclusion in the field to be, and so on and so forth. What that really means is those of us who are interested in EDI agendas, we've got a lot of work to do. And it doesn't seem to me terribly difficult to do that because we've got a very low bar to start from. Yeah. On to number 15, where we can start talking about theory. And I did mention in the abstract to this talk today that I would be referring to a couple of theoretical concepts just to make Christian happy. But ideally, I also put this particular book on the screen because it's one that I encourage all students to read, particularly PhD students, in terms of thinking about different ways you can come at your data as you collect it using theory. Another one that you might be a fan of, Christian, Karl Marx, on his grave, has these particularly poignant words: philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And I think this is one of the things that anyone who's ever really spent time reading Marx would say, that he wasn't terribly optimistic, but this was before, it's on his grave and now he's very optimistic. Yeah. But I guess the point there being that we spend a lot of time in this field doing critique and being somewhat negative about a lot of different things. And I think theory can really be used to affirmatively orientate towards what we do, how we do it, and how we do it inclusively. Yep. Another great quote that I've always found really poignant in the field of disability studies: not all of us can say with any degree of certainty that we have always been human, or that we are only that. Rosie Braidotti, the Posthuman, also really influential work in the field of disability studies. Encourage everyone to have a read of this if you haven't already. And we can get caught up in the language about what posthumanism is, post-structuralism, etc. And to some extent, it could turn into an argument of semantics. But I think what is really significant about this sort of theory that I find instructive is that it's about interconnection, and how interconnection between people, things, environments, technologies can make inclusion happen. And that's what's really significant to this. And once again, it becomes less about who's in the room and what they are bringing to the room, but the knowledge that they can co-create together in interconnection. Yeah. Hopefully we'll be going on to slide 19. And here's where I guess I can explain a little bit more about how using some of those ideas can relate to the field that I'm particularly interested in conceptually, and that is critical disability studies. And I'm sure many of you may have heard of the medical models and the social models of disability. They're kind of contrasting ideas where the medical model is suggesting that if you cannot be fixed, then that's part of the problem, yeah? And medicine is always trying to fix you. The social model is completely the opposite. What disables me is you guys. Yeah. But not necessarily. If we come at it using other ideas, and I think ableism is a really good one, that we get to think about the preferred ideal body and mind and aesthetic that makes a citizen, or in this case, we could say makes a student, makes a professional teacher, educator, professional in an accredited profession. And or the constitutional divide, where we can think about the constitutional divide that keeps people with particular disabilities, impairments away from things like this. And invariably, the constitutional divide has been presupposed. And this is one of the questions I guess we'd be asking by way of analysing the competency standards that apply to particular courses. On the whole, this sort of work lets us to really think about, and I've put up a couple of quotes here that I think are really poignant in terms of the categories of disability that we depend upon. Does the way that we understand inclusion for students with disabilities in the sector of higher education, is it even relevant anymore? And second to that, to question to what extent to which integrity is brought out from the shadows of regulatory compliance and engaged with as a moral and ethical commitment. That's the sort of work I guess we're pushing towards using some of these theories. Onto the empirical work. And I will just say, if anyone wants to discuss any of these particular theories in more detail, I'd be happy to provide readings, etc. I'm sure, Christian, you would, yeah? Research questions. So we were interested, my colleague and I, because in Australia, universities write their own competency standard statements, and we were being pushed to write one at Deakin University, where I was employed before. And we wanted, before we did that, first and foremost, to get to learn from students how they encounter inherent requirements and how certain policy drivers may exclude them from various parts of a teaching degree, or include them, in fact. So we ran a survey with students. We also ran a survey with staff members to ask how academics in the School of Education understand inherent requirements, competency standards, and how they think that their roles are influenced, or in fact how they influence the implementation of ideas around inherency, competency in teaching. So they're the two research questions that we really came with. What I'm going to do now is very quickly take you through a couple of findings from those surveys, results from those surveys, and we can talk about them collectively and come back and apply some of the ideas that we have in terms of analysis of those. How am I doing for time, Sarah? I've been smashing this. That's great. Thank you. 22, I hope. So here's the thing. We asked, we purposefully made an effort to run a survey that got more students with disabilities to respond to it than others. So we went to, what do we call it here? The enabling service or the disability, whatever. We went to them and we asked them to distribute our survey as well as going via the School of Education. So to having received a 36% vote, if you like, of a survey that said that these students wanted to disclose to us that they had a disability, that's a really high number. In Australia, it's roughly about 17.7%, roughly. I think here, in fact, I was reading since the pandemic here, it's gone up to 22%. Which says a lot about what happened there. 62% of students said that they did not have a disability. So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying here is that because we specifically went and chased down people with disabilities to respond to this, we got a higher number. Of course, we didn't get a huge majority, but we got a few. 23. If you believe that you had a disability or related condition likely to be impacted by inherent requirements, competency standards, who would your course unit, who would you notify? This was a question that we popped in the survey really to ask students what they would do if they found that there was a reason that they would encounter a barrier to their completing their course. Invariably, students indicated that they could enroll into a course of teaching. And bear in mind, this is a accredited Masters of Teaching, Bachelor of Teaching in Australia, that are always connected to the profession by way of the registration boards. Yeah. And to us, it was, and me in particular, I found this fascinating that, a majority obviously said they wouldn't bother because they didn't have to talk to anyone because inherent requirements were never going to cause a problem to them. But at the same time, interestingly, so we would call a unit chair there a module lead. Yeah. And so you'd get, and we had 16% would go to that, 17.5% would go to the course director, 32% would go to the DRC, the Disability Resource Centre, which is the enabling services here. And I think that says a lot to me in terms of, as all of us who are involved in teaching, how we seem to defer the responsibility of making adjustments to a particular bureaucratic wheel rather than to take responsibility for it ourselves. And students themselves felt that they would be more likely to get what they needed if they went not to their teachers, but they went to the bureaucratic wheel. Yeah. And here's where it gets interesting. If inherent requirements were going to make you, were likely, let me start again. If the existence of inherent requirements make you more or less likely to disclose, we got 26% said, well, they're more likely, 11.5 not as likely, no difference. Obviously, the 62% who said they didn't have a disability. So this, I guess, comes down to the idea that, we can revert this back to the understanding that those who were more likely to disclose that they had a disability because of the inherent requirements or the competency standards associated with their course, they would do so on the perhaps innocent understanding that they would get reasonable adjustments that would allow them to continue. Yeah. And I did jump ahead because I think it gets more interesting here. If you're less likely to disclose that you have a disability, why is that? And there's some interesting responses here. They don't want to be hindered opportunities. They don't want stigma. They may disclose, but they'd feel uncomfortable about doing so. Standing out, inequitable treatment, obstacles to graduation, obviously a big one, not being able to become a teacher that they may have so wished. And here's where, I guess, using our ideas about ableism, I would suggest here that a take-home message is that disability in this instance can be entirely, well, perhaps not entirely, but very much institutionally made, yeah, because the policies have forced students to make a decision that they may or may not feel comfortable with. On to how staff understood the whole discussion around inherent requirements. I reflect that we come from a really large, I was working in a really large education school. I think we had 150 staff. We only got 31 responding to our survey, which may or may not say a lot. Where are we? Am I 27 or 28? Okay, so here's where we got 31. 3 disclosed a disability. Again, that could mean something. I didn't fill out my own survey. I didn't know there were that many teachers with disabilities there. Here's, I think, some interesting points that that if teachers, if we're thinking here that the profession sets the standards and we simply follow them and enforce them. And we had quite a large number here of staff who would agree with that statement, that we simply follow the line and do what we're told in terms of setting what is competency in the field. That could say a lot as well, I think. And then I think this is also a really interesting point where we're asking staff members to think about what impact would the competency standards inherent requirements have on students who may or may not have a disability. And again, I think it's really interesting here that a lot of the staff are saying, well, I'm not really sure. I don't know what the impact is because, well, I guess we hadn't explained to them that they can have a huge impact and perhaps they hadn't read the literature. Yeah. On to number 30, and I am nearly finished here, so I've gone way quicker than I'd planned, Sarah, but there you go. Here's where I want to draw back to some of the analysis of what it is that we're referring to in the publications that we've put out so far, and the sort of work that I intend to continue in this field, because it seems to me, and I guess the terms that we're using here is coherency, that we've come up with the idea of, instead of inherent requirements. I guess that's a very Australian-centric term. And I haven't come up with one for competency yet. Maybe we can work on that together. But instead of inherency, how about coherency? And the primary issue here is that is to do with the premise of individualism, which is embedded in most psychological theory, and these psychological that we tend to be using in the field of higher education, and in particular in courses of this kind. And the learning actor sketched out in inclusive education and employability literature is a rational individual whose performance is consistent across time. And no matter how much recognition is given to the person in the world, or the idea that learning and employability is about ongoing development, she or he or they remain bounded decision-making units. Yeah. And the promise of psychological discourse to direct, inherent, objective, and unequivocally beneficial student profiles is false. And this is the idea from Steve Vassallo, who is an American critical psychologist. Any act of naming and measuring students is bound to history, power, culture, politics, and ideology. And these acts will have both unintended and intended consequences, which are reflected in the interpretation of experience, the formation of selfhood, pedagogical structures, and forms of self-regulation. We use these ideas in the papers that we've published so far, or at least one of them, to really narrow down a discourse analysis of the sort of work that we're talking about when we're trying to change the ideas that we need to promote inherency and to move instead towards coherency. Is that 31? Out of 33, everyone, I'm nearly done. So turning to coherency rather than inherency to support higher education institutions internationally, to support inclusive employability priorities is the sort of work that we want to make here. And the rationality of the matter. In the real world, everyone cannot do everything. And that's the point that we're trying to make here in terms of making interconnections between people, things, technologies, animals. People are able to go into classrooms and to teach and I guess this speaks a lot to the sort of work that Vassilis does on co-teaching, in terms of the sorts of work that we can achieve if we didn't put all of these ideas into testing the individual capacity, particularly when we're doing that in terms of their sensory, communicative, etc., abilities that are really based on inherent skills and competencies that may not be so relevant to the field that we're working in. That is almost me, but I just will add here, and it's something that we do in Australia, and I wondered if we do something like that here, but I just would like to acknowledge the Indigenous, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Australia, where much of this knowledge that we've been working on has been created. And that's a thing we do in Australia to acknowledge the country that we're on, and that's encompasses the city of Melbourne, Australia. And I do wonder if we do things like that here, because I think there's something interesting here when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges and how they also relate to ideas around inclusion and diversity, and or perhaps better said, the ways that they do not relate to inclusion and diversity in ways that we do. and the Western framework of knowledge that we are working in has proven to be somewhat exclusionary for so many people for so many reasons. And it's maybe time that we used alternative ideas, ones that have actually been with us for a really long time, to reframe how we do those very things. That's me, except for my beautiful reference list. Thank you.
Thank you very much.